during the related show are those of the show personalities and guest alone, and not those of Vic Canellis Media Group, its parent, affiliates, or stations. VCMG Live is not responsible for any content, information, or opinions expressed. User bears full responsibility for their reliance on such content, information, or opinions.
Welcome to Making Money with Laura Sanders, a name you can trust. With over 20 years of real estate experience and selling over 150 homes a year, Laura Sanders is the #1 RE/MAX agent in the state of Florida for 2021. Join us each week as we discuss how to make money through buying and flipping homes, to renting versus selling, and everything in between. To join the conversation, call in live. 888-994-4995, Studio A.
Hi everyone, and welcome to Making Money with Laura Sanders, and I am your host, Laura Sanders. So every week we talk about something that helps you to save some money, whether it be in flipping homes or getting a lower mortgage interest rate, all different kinds of things. Today I'm going to help buyers, sellers, and realtors make sure you don't make a mistake when it comes to your condo addendum and what we need to know about rules and regulations on disclosing all different kinds of information on assessments. So this has become very dear to my heart because I feel like there's a lot going on out there, a lot of assessments, especially since the collapse of Surfside. So let's welcome Charles Esposito with JK Closings. He is the managing partner over there and the big dog. So welcome, Charles. Thank you for coming out.
Thank you for having me.
So I have started to take a look at like what's going on, and I had printed, or I should say I had sent myself, talking about the condo addendum, right? And I started to get harassed by another realtor. And when I say harassed, I mean really harassed. I can send her this video when we're done.
Okay.
So it talks about seller's representation, that the seller is not aware of any special assessments or other assessments that have been levied. Levy means like that's happening for sure. Yep.
Correct.
By the association, or has been an item on the agenda. Now, an item on the agenda is different than being levied, right?
Right.
So it's an item. It's on the agenda. They've talked about it, right?
Yeah.
Or reported in the minutes, which the minutes are part of the agenda, right? Because the minutes, they have an agenda.
The minutes will come after the meeting.
Right.
So the meeting will have an agenda that'll state what they're going to talk about.
Right.
And then the minutes will say what the conversation,
Said.
hopefully what the conversation
Right.
was in the meeting.
So it says, or reported in the minutes of the association with the past 12 months.
Yep.
Prior to the effective date of the contract. So number one, that tells me that if I have a listing and it's on the market for 4 months, every month I need to be getting new minutes.
It would be a good idea to do that, especially because you want to figure out what that association is talking about. I always advise realtors and sellers to make sure they're on the same page with the association, especially now. We talked about it last time I was on, but in the aftermath of the Surfside tragedy, there's been new law in Florida, and it's leading to a lot of special assessments. So a condo that may not have had a special assessment the last time you sold property in that association, it might have an assessment now and you wouldn't know it because everything is moving very quickly with condos. So yeah, absolutely. You want to check the minutes. You want to make sure your seller's up to date on what's going on with the building if they're selling. A lot of sellers say, oh, I don't know anything about that, but they're members of the association. So they are on notice for everything that happens in the association, whether or not they pay attention to it. They're in the best position to know what's going on with that building, not the buyer. The buyer doesn't know what's going on in the building. They don't live there.
So like for me personally, I'm adopting a new rule that I'm going to request the meeting minutes up front when I get the listing. Typically the association will require the seller to sign some kind of a release that to allow them to do that, or I can ask the seller to go directly. Give you an example, today I'm supposed to close tomorrow on a 4-unit building in Boca. I have somebody that's selling it, and they ended up saying that they needed the minutes now.
Yeah, so The seller, per the as-is contract in Florida, is not actually required to give the minutes to the buyer. But if the buyer requests it, especially during their due diligence period, there's no reason not to give it to them. Condos are supposed to have this information available online as well. Not all of them do.
No, they don't.
There are certain documents that the association is required to have and that the seller is required to give to the buyer prior to closing. And if they don't give it to the buyer prior to closing, the buyer can void the contract all the way up to the closing date. So,
well, that's the frequently asked questions.
Frequently asked questions and answers, articles, bylaws and rules.
Budget.
It's not actually the budget, it's the most recent year-end financial information, which would be 2022. And then, you know, within the first couple months of 2024, hopefully they'll get an audited financial statement. So then you'll have 2023s.
Okay.
Yeah, so that's a common misconception
Well, you have to
too
be very
with
careful,
sellers.
though,
Because
too,
if you give a budget, that's not actually what the contract says.
Yeah, but a lot of times, though, when you're selling a condo, and if you're getting ready to close, let's just say in December, and they decide to request the budget for the coming year, and it doesn't, let's say in 2023, they have 10% reserves, but in 2024, they're going to be 9.5.
Yep.
That could crush
I'm
a
not
deal
suggesting
if
that
it's a
you
December
shouldn't
closing.
get the budget. You absolutely should get the budget. It's just what the contract actually says the seller's required to give.
Right.
So absolutely, you definitely need to get the budget. You need to figure out what the reserves are.
But it also says, though, that you need to, there's a line, right, in the contract. And on this line, it basically says that if they're, you know, it's saying that if it's not put on this line, right, except for the following, it says association assets and liabilities, including, you know, it's saying that like these certain things need to be on there to say, and if you don't disclose that, then it's saying that the seller would be liable to pay that.
Right.
But it has to be levied. But if you don't tell them something that's in the minutes, what's the liability?
Right. So to go back to the original thought about special assessments, the condo rider that we're talking about and the seller disclosure information and the minutes and what's in there, the seller is responsible for paying for anything that is specially assessed up until the closing date. And if it exists before you go under contract, the seller's definitely going to be responsible for it if they don't disclose it. Okay? If they do disclose it on the two lines of the contract that you're talking about, if it's due before the closing date, the seller's responsible for it. If it's due after the closing date, the buyer could be responsible for it depending on what box is checked on the contract and what's negotiated. If something does not exist, meaning it wasn't levied and it's not in the minutes for the year prior to the contract, and it comes into effect after the effective date, meaning you and I sign a contract today, there's nothing, no inkling of a special assessment, then tomorrow the association issues notice of a special assessment, and then that special assessment is due after the closing date, the buyer is responsible for that. Okay? If it's due at or prior to closing, the seller is responsible for that. That's how the contract works.
But what happens when you don't disclose something that was on the agenda?
So, and this goes to your situation specifically.
Right.
The seller did not disclose something that was on the agenda, so it is considered pending at that point. However, in your situation, nothing was ever levied, so there's nothing due at or prior to closing. So the seller's not responsible for paying anything because there is no special assessment.
Okay.
The buyer in your situation, the buyer's realtor, want your seller to pay for something. And so I said, well, what are they paying for? How much is owed? And you said, well, we don't know how much is owed because nothing's been passed.
She's going on based on previous
Exactly.
buildings.
So the buyer is saying, well, something might happen in the future, essentially. That's what she's saying. So no, the seller's not responsible for that. Even though they didn't disclose that there was something in the minutes,
Right.
if there was something due prior to closing, then the seller would be responsible for it. If there was something levied and it was due after the closing, the seller would be responsible for it because they didn't disclose it. But there's nothing actually due at any time. We can't say there was something in the minutes 11 months ago and they're still talking about it and we have no idea how much it's going to cost. The seller can't be responsible for paying for that because we still don't know what's going to be passed. When the buyer purchases the property, they can show up at all of those meetings and they can say, I do not want to pay this special assessment, and they can vote because there's going to be a vote on a special assessment. It has not happened yet. Okay. So once the buyer purchases the property, they're going to be responsible for it in that case. Okay,
so I think though what is most important to take out of most of this is that, like for instance, my seller was 91. Mm-hmm. He doesn't do email. Mm-hmm. He's not going to request minutes. But I think it's important for everyone to understand who is the one that needs to be on top of this. So we're going to go to commercial break, and when we come back, we're going to talk about, like, if you have a 91-year-old seller, like, is it the realtor's responsibility? Is it the owner's responsibility? Who's liable here if this isn't disclosed? So when we come back from looking at our wonderful sponsors, commercials, we'll be right back, and we'll talk more about who's at fault if it's not disclosed.
At JK Closing Attorneys, we do all of the same things that a title company does, but with the benefits of being a law office. We can help with residential real estate, short sales, commercial real estate, refinances, 1031 exchanges, and FRIPTA withholding.
Contact JK Closing Attorneys today at 954-332-3111. Again, that is 954-332-3111.
Whether you're buying, selling, refinancing, or building your dream home, you have a lot riding on your loan specialist. Max Fish, a top 1% mortgage loan officer in the nation, will give you a same-day qualifying quote. Max Fish is committed to providing his customers with mortgage services that exceed their expectations. Ensuring that you make the right choice for you and your family is his ultimate goal. Contact Max Fish today at 954-729-6933 or max.fisch@nwmcorp.net.
You have been watching Making Money with Laura. For more information, contact Laura Sanders at 954-650-0827 or visit her website at theloracell.com. And now back to the show.
Hi everyone, and welcome back to Making Money with Laura Sanders, and I am your host, Laura Sanders. If you are looking for an excellent realtor, I would be your girl. Give me a call, 954-650-0827. If you're looking for an amazing attorney that can help you through all your real estate needs, Charles, tell us how they can get a hold of you.
Thanks, Laura. You can reach out to us, 954-332-3111. We have offices all over South Florida, and we can close a deal anywhere in Florida.
So now we're talking about who's liable. Mm-hmm. Who's liable when signing these contracts? I mean... Mm-hmm.
Ultimately, it's always the seller when we're talking about assessments. So if they don't disclose a special assessment, it is the seller's responsibility. Your client who was 91 years old, can we really expect the 91-year-old client to know what's going on in the minutes from 11 months ago? Not necessarily, which is why you need to have a realtor that knows what she's doing or he's doing on a transaction. And I always recommend to realtors to speak to the property manager, speak to the board member that's in control of everything. There's always one that's kind of like the head honcho. You want to know whether or not there's a special assessment that's in the pipeline. You hear that all the time from board members. Well, we have this in the pipeline. This is coming down. The worst thing that can happen for a seller is that no one has talked about anything officially in the minutes, and then a buyer goes to their interview with a board member, and the board member says, before we sign off on your approval, we'd like to let you know that there's going to be a big special assessment coming down the pipeline. And then the buyer freaks out and doesn't want to close, and all of a sudden there might be a suit between the seller and the association because no special assessment actually exists. But if we are on the same page with the board members and the property manager from the outset, you might be able to say to a board member, well, wait a minute, is there a special assessment? Show me the minutes. Show me the agenda where this was discussed. And then they might back off and say, well, actually, we haven't talked about it yet. It's just what they would like to happen. Maybe they don't have the votes for it. Maybe they want to prepare all the new buyers so that the new buyer is more likely to vote for it. Who knows? But that happens a lot, unfortunately. And I do think that realtors need to be able to ask those questions ahead of time because they can't just rely on their sellers to know. The sellers are always, and the buyers are always hiring realtors because realtors are supposed to be real estate professionals that know this stuff. Whether or not you're taught about it or not, whether or not you have advice from an attorney like us at JK Closing Attorneys that's telling you these things. Most realtors don't. So, you know, with you, you have experience in these types of transactions and you've seen a lot of different things happen. So you know, just from your own knowledge base, you need to be asking this, you need to be asking that from the associations. A lot of realtors, especially if they don't have the experience, even realtors that have been doing it for 25 years, I hear that all the time, I've been doing real estate for 25 years. Okay, well, if there's a special assessment from last week and you don't know about it, your last 25 years of experience are not helping you because you didn't ask the association that, you know?
So I guess the longer you have a listing, the more often you should be asking. So even if so when you have a listing for like right before you go to contract, you probably have to ask again. Here's the problem though. Some of these associations tell us, well, that's an estoppel and you have to pay for it. Like I just had one recently told me they would not give me the frequently asked questions and that I needed to pay $185 for it. And I said,
yeah.
It's frequently asked questions.
I know, and
they
the frequently
said
asked questions and answers document.
I go, okay, well, here's 4 of them. Let me give you the other 4 afterwards.
That's funny. A frequently asked questions and answers document is not the same thing as an estoppel.
Right.
So there are documents that the association is required to have and required to give to a seller upon request, or an owner. They don't have to be selling. And some associations will charge a fee for printing documents or gathering documents. And if that's what the association does, unfortunately, you're a member of that association, you have to abide by their rules, as long as the rules are proper. An estoppel, they can charge for. Right. They can charge $250 for an estoppel, and there are different questions. An estoppel is something that we need to do a closing in order to clear title. It tells us how much money the seller owes to the association, how much we have to collect in advance from the buyer potentially if there are any capital contributions. It tells us whether or not there are violations from the seller. It tells us whether or not there are special assessments, and it tells us what the regular maintenance assessments are too. So we've been talking a lot about special assessments, and you mentioned budget meetings. Budget meetings often happen in November. So in some associations where they cannot pass a special assessment because they don't have the votes for it, they may change their budget and collect more on their regular maintenance in order to fill their reserves so that they don't have to do a special assessment. I had an association last year that went from $500 a quarter to $1,200 a quarter because they couldn't pass a special assessment.
Why could you not? Because you couldn't get the votes.
They couldn't get the votes, and in their rules for that association, it was the members that had to vote on a special assessment. It wasn't just like 5 board members. So all of the members of the association would not vote for a special assessment. So then in the budget meeting, which only required the votes of 5 members, they changed from $500 a quarter to $1,200 a quarter. But that didn't take effect until January, and the buyer bought in December. So the seller said that they did not know that the regular maintenance assessment was changing. And then January 1st, the buyer got hit with $1,200 for the first quarter and didn't know why it was $1,200 because the contract only said $500.
Who's liable there?
I would say that the seller should be responsible for that because they didn't disclose it. And the seller is in the best position to know what's going on with the association, whether they're paying attention or not.
But it didn't come back on the estoppel.
It's not on the estoppel because there was nothing to collect. We were in December.
So the buyer could sue the seller and get what, like a year, 5 years, 3 years?
That's an interesting one because how
long? Now you're a litigator, right? That's not even you guys. That would be a litigator.
That would not be us. No, thank God that's not me. I don't know. How long is the buyer anticipated to stay there? Because that $700 a quarter is almost $3,000 a year, you know, and how long are they going to stay there for? 10 years? Is that $30,000?
Yeah, we would say the average person stays in their house 5 to 7 years.
Yeah, and I have to imagine that there would be an agreement between the seller and the buyer so that the buyer doesn't sue them to prevent litigation, and it's whatever the buyer would be happy with.
I don't think the seller would do that. I think they would say, "Oh, I'm in the right."
Yeah.
And now
let's
play devil's advocate here for a minute. Listing agent in this particular instance, right?
Yeah.
What's the liability on the agents? And I think the agents want to know this. Like, I think that these are things that agents, they want to know. Like, what's my liability? Like, guys, we need to be careful when we're doing this. Like, you could be sued for anything And these sounds like legitimate reasons to me.
Yeah. Anyone could sue anyone for anything.
But this
it doesn't
sounds
mean that they
legitimate.
can win.
Right. But
You
let's say
know?
the agent didn't say to the seller,
Yeah.
hey, listen, it says minutes.
Right.
Like it talks about meetings.
Right.
So
In most situations, brokers and agents are not going to be liable because it's ultimately a contract between the seller and the buyer.
and our listing agreement says that they're supposed to disclose to us.
Yes, the seller has to disclose everything that's going on, and they also have to indemnify brokers and buyers and sellers in the as-is contract. It says that you have to indemnify brokers for any representations made on behalf of the client. So let's say the seller lies to you about something, and you're essentially conveying that lie to the buyer. Well, that's not your fault. The seller lied to you. So you're protected in that situation. So here we're talking about something that was omitted by the seller. It's not a lie, it's just that the seller didn't tell you about it. So you didn't tell the buyer about it. Well, that can't be your responsibility as an agent because you didn't know about it. Now, we might also argue, sorry about that, it's time to look at our wires for the day. So you might, feel that you should be asking the association for these things, and maybe a good realtor would be asking the association for these things, but ultimately it's not your responsibility as the realtor and the broker to find out the information that the seller should be telling you.
Do you know how much harder it is to sell a condo than a house?
It's way harder to sell a condo.
It's like,
you have an
it's
association.
tiring.
Absolutely.
I'm
we
being serious.
often say that, and
We get paid
condos,
less commission.
Condos
Most
are usually
times,
less
yeah.
money than houses as well. I mean, we always joke about it in the office. A $50,000 sale is usually a lot harder than $1 million sale.
It
It's
is.
just the way that it is.
I mean, you
Yep.
think about it, it's like in a homeowners association, like what have you seen? Like $500, like I haven't seen in a lot of homeowners association assessments, like in homeowner, like maybe 500 after like Wilma for like removing trees or something. Like you see like very low, associations that have been around for about 20, 25 years, you'll see like small increases, like $20 a year, maybe every other year, every 3 years, and you don't see big assessments, and you don't really feel like you have to worry about minutes of meetings, and it's usually nothing of like of substance. These condos, especially with what's going on right now, like any condo that's more than 2 stories is going to have to become, by law, fully funded.
Yeah.
And
they're
that's going
reserves.
to be, when people ask me what's fully funded, well,
Yeah.
every condo is going to be different.
Yeah, it depends on how many different common areas they have. It depends on how many different things
Roofs,
that cost
painting.
over $10,000 that they have. So if they have an elevator system, to replace that would cost more than $10,000. So that's something that would have to be included in a structural integrity reserve study. So every condo that's 3 stories or higher, they're going to have fully funded reserves. And those places that you were talking about that have been around for 35, 40 years, and they've had very low regular maintenance assessments and no special assessments in the past, well, that just tells me that that's a place that has not kept up with the common areas of their building. And so when they do their 40-year inspection or their 30-year inspection, whatever
heard now
is the
it's for
medline that
25
comes up,
now.
yeah, if they're close to the coastline, every 25 years is the first milestone inspection, and then every 10 years thereafter. So most places, 30 to 40 years, are going to have a milestone inspection coming up sometime shortly. And they're going to have special assessments. If they've had low maintenance assessments and no special assessments at any time in the last 10 years, they are going to have special assessments in the near future.
So what I want to say, though, and convey today to everyone is just because he told you realtors that you're not really liable, let me just tell you, you still can get sued and you'll still have to defend yourself.
Well, and I would say, too, you want to get those good Google reviews as a
Yeah.
realtor. You want to get referrals.
Yeah.
Okay, you want everyone, we always want everyone to be happy at the closing table.
So just do your job.
Exactly. If you do your job, don't worry about getting sued, but you want to make everybody happy.
So how can we get a hold of you?
954-332-3111, legal@jkclosings.com. If you have any contracts you want us to review, give us a call.
All right, and you can just send it right over. They'll take a look at it, and
Absolutely.
Definitely. So, and if you're looking for a top agent and you want to get some remodeling done to your home to get top dollar, we're doing 0% interest on your home for a second mortgage to get that home in the best shape possible so that you can get the most money possible. Proven track record. So, thank you everyone for listening tonight. Until next time, thanks.
Thank you for tuning in for Making Money with Laura Sanders, a name you can trust. To join the conversation, call us at the studio, 888-994-4995 Studio A, or contact Laura directly at 954-650-0827. Laura Sanders, a name you can trust. We look forward to seeing you next week.
The opinions expressed